Welcome back, deep divers. We're diving deep today, folks.
Into the world of the Supreme Court.
You got it. And procedural rules? Oh boy, the rules, right. Today's case is Nutraceutical Corporation v. Lambert, a real mouthful.
Certainly is. And basically, it all boils down to the Supreme Court saying, nope, no extensions on that 14-day deadline for appealing class action decisions. Even if you've got what seem like good reasons for the delay, they're sticking to that rule.
And this isn't just some dry legal technicality, my friends. It really impacts how these big class action lawsuits play out. You know, the ones where a whole bunch of people are affected.
Yeah, think David versus Goliath, but with way more Davids involved.
Exactly. So let's break this down, shall we? First things first, what was this whole case even about?
Well, this all started with Troy Lambert. He claimed that Nutraceutical Corporation wasn't exactly playing fair and square with their marketing for a dietary supplement. You know, maybe a little truth stretching going on.
Ah, those tricky supplements, always promising the moon and the stars.
Right. So Lambert decided to sue. And at first, the district court said, okay, this could be a class action, bunching together all the folks who felt similarly misled.
Makes sense. Strength in numbers, right?
Exactly. But then on February 20th, 2015, the district court did a bit of a U-turn. They decertified the class, meaning it was back to being just Lambert versus Nutraceutical. And that's the decision that really gets the ball rolling here.
Okay, decertification. Got it. But I'm guessing there's a way to fight back against that, right? You don't just have to accept it.
You're right on the money. There's this specific rule, Federal Rule of Civil Procedure 23F, that lets a party, in this case Lambert, go to the Court of Appeals and say, hey, hold up, let's take a second look at this class certification thing. But, and this is key, they've only got 14 days from the date of that decertification order to do it. It's a tight window.
14 days. Wow, that's like less than 2 weeks.
Yep.
No time to waste, huh? But Lambert's lawyers, they didn't immediately jump on that appeal, did they?
Nope, they took a different route. 10 days after the decertification, on March 2nd, they told the district court they were planning to file a motion for reconsideration.
Meaning they wanted the district court to basically rethink its own decision.
Precisely. And the district court was like, all right, you've got until March 12th to file that motion.
So while that 14-day clock for going to the higher court was ticking away, they were trying to get the lower court to change its mind.
Yeah, a two-pronged strategy. And they did file that motion for reconsideration right on the deadline of March 12th. But here's the catch. That was already 20 days after the original decertification order. 6 days past that appeal window.
Uh-oh, sounds like trouble brewing.
And it was. The district court ended up denying that reconsideration request on June 24th. Then, on July 8th, exactly 14 days after that denial, Lambert finally went to the Ninth Circuit, asking for permission to appeal that original decertification way back from February 20th.
Okay, so now we're getting to the heart of this whole legal battle. Nutraceutical is obviously not happy about this delayed appeal, right?
Yeah, absolutely not. They're saying, hey, that 14-day deadline came and went. You snooze, you lose, Lambert.
And what did the Ninth Circuit say to that?
Well, they actually sided with Lambert. They said, look, this deadline in Rule 23, it's not what we call jurisdictional. Think of jurisdictional rules as the big non-negotiable requirements for a court to even hear a case. This wasn't that, more like procedural guidelines.
Guidelines, so a little wiggle room maybe?
That's what the Ninth Circuit thought. They said, this 14-day thing, it can be subject to something called equitable tolling. Basically, a legal doctrine that says, hey, in certain situations where it's fair, we can pause or extend a deadline. They felt that because Lambert was pretty quick in letting the district court know they were going to ask for reconsideration, and they followed all the instructions, it was only right to basically hit pause on that 14-day appeal clock.
So fairness and being on the ball, that's what swayed the Ninth Circuit. But I bet Nutraceutical wasn't ready to give up just yet.
Oh, you know it. They took this whole thing to the big leagues, the Supreme Court. Now we're talking. So let's see what each side brought to the table when they faced the justices, starting with Nutraceutical's argument as to why they felt this appeal was way past due.
Lead the way.
All right, so Nutraceutical's main point was, once the other side brings up this whole timeliness thing, that 14-day deadline, it's set in stone, got to be strict about it. And they even had some Supreme Court backup for this, citing two previous cases, Carlisle v. United States and United States v. Robinson. In those cases, the court wasn't budging on similar time limits in criminal cases, even when there were seemingly decent reasons for the delay.
So they're basically saying, look, Supreme Court's got a track record of being tough on deadlines, no special treatment here.
Exactly. And they didn't stop there. They pulled out another big gun, Federal Rule of Appellate Procedure 26B. This rule talks about when those higher courts can extend time limits. But, and it's a big BUT, it specifically says they may not extend the time to file a petition for permission to appeal. Nutraceutical was like, see, it's right there in black and white, no extending that 14-day deadline for those class action appeals.
Okay, point taken. But what about the fact that the district court itself told Lambert when to file that reconsideration motion? Didn't Nutraceutical have to address whether that might justify some flexibility with the deadline?
Oh, they did. They argued that the usual practice, letting someone file that appeal within 14 days after a timely reconsideration motion is denied, well, that's not equitable tolling. It's just common sense. Keeps the higher court from jumping in while the lower court's still tinkering, gives the district court a chance to fix any whoopsies, and respects their authority in the case. They were drawing a line in the sand, basically. This normal practice doesn't mean you can just ignore the 14-day rule whenever you feel like it.
So they're making a distinction between a reconsideration filed within that initial window, which resets the clock, and one like Lambert's, which was filed outside of it.
You got it. And they went on to point out the advisory committee notes that came along with that Rule 23F back in '98. Those notes stressed the need for a quick 14-day turnaround to keep those class action cases moving. Nutraceutical argued that making exceptions all willy-nilly would defeat the whole purpose of having that speedy time frame.
Makes sense. Got to keep things flowing. But what about those unique circumstances exceptions you sometimes hear about with procedural rules? Like when a judge accidentally gives misleading info, can't that buy you some extra time?
They tackled that head-on, too. Nutraceutical said, even that very narrow exception, usually reserved for when a judge straight up misleads someone about a deadline, it shouldn't apply here. They argued that those rules are so clear, there's basically no room for any other exceptions, and they didn't think the district court had done anything misleading enough to trigger it. Importantly, they also pointed out that Lambert could still appeal that whole class certification thing after the main case wrapped up and there was a final judgment. So it wasn't like he was completely losing his shot at an appeal down the line.
Okay, so Nutraceutical really hammered home that rules are rules.
Yeah.
Message. Now let's switch gears and hear what Lambert's side had to say. How did they try to convince the Supreme Court that their appeal wasn't actually late?
Well, at first they tried to argue that their appeal was actually on time based on the existing rules. They pointed to Rule 59E, which is all about motions to change a final judgment, and Rule 54, which deals with judgments involving multiple parties or claims. But that didn't really fly with the justices, especially Justice Ginsburg. She pointed out that Rule 59E usually applies to the end-of-the-line decisions that wrap up a case in the trial court, not these mid-case orders like the class decertification.
So that initial argument didn't quite hit the mark. What else did they have up their sleeve?
They then shifted gears and argued that Rule 23, since it's not a jurisdictional rule, it's automatically open to that whole equitable tolling concept we talked about. They cited some past Supreme Court cases like Harris Truck Lines and Thompson v. INS to back up the idea that fairness can sometimes trump strict deadlines, especially when it's not about a court's fundamental power to hear a case.
Okay, so they're leaning hard on that fairness angle. But how did they connect their motion for reconsideration to all of this?
They said, look, our motion for reconsideration, even though it was filed outside that initial 14 days, but before the deadline the district court gave us, it basically hit the pause button on that time to appeal. They cited cases like Dieter, Healy, and Ibarra, mostly from criminal law, that talked about how certain post-trial motions can affect appeal deadlines. They emphasized that the district court even entertained their reconsideration motion and put everything else on hold, which suggested that the decertification order wasn't really final while they were still mulling it over.
I mean, it makes sense. Why appeal something if the lower court might still change its mind, right?
Exactly. Lambert also said, hey, the district court told us to file that reconsideration motion by March 12th, which was after that 14-day appeal window. We thought we were good. They even compared it to Thompson v. INS, where the Supreme Court let someone slide on a late filing because a lower court had given them the wrong deadline info.
So they're saying, we trusted the district court, don't punish us for that.
Right. And to top it off, they reminded everyone about how important that whole equitable tolling thing is in American law. It's been around forever. They also dissected Rule 26B, the one that prohibits courts from extending appeal deadlines. Lambert argued that there's a difference between extending a deadline ahead of time and letting something slide after the fact if it's fair. They said that Rule 26B might stop a court from giving extra time before the 14 days are up, but it doesn't say they can't allow a late appeal if justice demands it.
Wow. Sounds like Lambert's team really threw everything they had at this. So, drum roll, please. What did the Supreme Court have to say after all that?
In a unanimous decision written by Justice Sotomayor, the court sided with Nutraceutical. They said that 14-day deadline in Rule 23 is not subject to equitable tolling if the other side cries foul about it being late.
So Nutraceutical wins this round, huh? But I thought the court did agree that Rule 23 isn't jurisdictional.
Yeah, they clarified that point. Just because a rule isn't jurisdictional, meaning it's not about a court's fundamental power, it doesn't mean you can just extend it or pause it with this equitable tolling thing. The key is the actual wording of the rule. Remember that Carlisle case? They brought that up again. If the rules say no tolling allowed in plain English, then courts can't make exceptions, even if someone was trying their best to follow the rules.
So it all boils down to what the rules actually say and don't say,
You
right?
got it. This case really drives home that point. And the court, they looked closely at those appellate rules, especially Rule 26B. Now, Rule 2 generally gives those higher courts power to bend their own rules for good reason. But, and it's a big BUT, it says, except as otherwise provided in Rule 26B. Then, in Rule 26B1, it says straight up, may not extend the time to file a petition for permission to appeal. The Supreme Court said, look, this is clear as day. They wanted a strict deadline for these appeals, and we got to respect that.
So the way those rules are written, that's what sealed the deal. And what about all of Lambert's arguments? How did the court address those?
They went through them one by one, shutting them down. Remember how Lambert tried to say there's a difference between extending and permitting a late filing? Well, the court pointed to the Robinson case, where they already shot down that argument in a similar criminal case. No reason to treat it differently here, they said. And as for those advisory committee notes that emphasized a quick deadline, the court said those were mainly about whether the appeals court should actually grant permission to appeal, not about whether the initial request was on time.
Okay, makes sense. What about the whole thing with appeals being allowed within 14 days at a reconsideration decision?
The court said that's not actually equitable tolling. They explained that a timely reconsideration motion basically means the original order isn't final yet, so the clock for that 14-day rule doesn't even start ticking until after the reconsideration is settled. But remember, Lambert's reconsideration motion wasn't filed within that initial 14-day window, so that whole practice didn't help him. They even cited United States v. Ibarra to back this up.
So in the end, it was nutraceutical all the way. What happened to the case after the Supreme Court's decision?
Well, they told the Ninth Circuit to reverse their decision, basically sending the case back down to them. But they did say that the Ninth Circuit could still look at any other arguments Lambert had about his appeal being on time, as long as those arguments didn't rely on this whole equitable tolling thing.
So maybe a glimmer of hope for Lambert, but a long shot.
Yeah, the big takeaway here is that this case emphasizes just how important it is to follow those procedural rules, especially when it comes to deadlines.
It really highlights the difference between those jurisdictional rules, which are non-negotiable, and the claim processing rules like this one. But as the court made clear, just because a rule isn't jurisdictional doesn't mean you can just ignore it or bend it.
Exactly. And remember those cases, Carlisle and Robinson? Well, this case is like the Supreme Court saying, hey, what we said there about strict deadlines, it applies to civil cases too, not just criminal ones.
So, lesson learned.
Mm-hmm.
If you're thinking about appealing a class action decision, don't mess around with that 14-day deadline.
Nope, you got to be on top of it. This case is a wake-up call for everyone involved in those kinds of lawsuits.
Now let's put on our imaginary robes and step into the 10th chair where Talk Testimonies gets to play Supreme Court Justice for a day. How would we have ruled on this case?
Well, sitting in the 10th chair, Talk Testimonies would have also voted to overturn what the Ninth Circuit did. We agree with the majority that those appellate rules are pretty darn clear. Rule 26B1 says it all, may not extend the time. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. And when you look at that rule alongside the more general power given in Rule 2, but with the specific exception carved out for Rule 26B, it's hard to argue that equitable tolling has a place here.
And those past cases, Carlisle and Robinson, those really seem to support that strict approach to deadlines, don't they?
Absolutely. Even though those were criminal cases, the core idea, sticking to what the rules say about time limits, that's the same here. Look, equitable tolling is important. It's a safety net in lots of legal situations, but you can't use it to just override clear rules, especially when those rules were designed to keep things moving smoothly, like in these class action cases. Letting tolling fly here would just create chaos and invite delays. Our decision in the 10th chair would be all about respecting the rules as they're written.
So what kind of impact would our ruling have on the legal world?
It would send a message, loud and clear, stick to those procedural deadlines. It wouldn't matter if a rule was jurisdictional or not. If it says no extensions, you gotta mean it. This would give everyone clear guidance and make sure everyone's playing by the same rules, especially when it comes to those appeals under Rule 23. No more hoping for a get-out-of-jail-free card with equitable tolling. You miss that deadline, you're likely out of luck.
Well, folks, that wraps up our deep dive into Nutraceutical Corporation v. Lambert. A fascinating case with some important lessons about the power of those procedural rules, even the ones that seem kind of small at first glance.
Just to recap, the Supreme Court said no to equitable tolling for that 14-day deadline to appeal class action decisions under Rule 23. If the other side objects, you're stuck with that deadline.
And a friendly reminder, folks, everything we've talked about today, including our imaginary ruling in the 10th chair, is just for informational purposes. It's not legal advice, and it doesn't reflect the official views of the actual Supreme Court.
Always remember, the law is a complex beast. We encourage you to keep digging deeper, keep those questions coming, and join us next time for another exciting deep dive into the world of legal decisions.
Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and keep those legal minds sharp.